I am quite aware that the other fellows in the office regard me as something of an oddity, as being rather a queer bird, in fact. Well, of course, a woman who happens to be of a studious disposition, who dislikes noise and prefers her own company to that of empty-headed companions, who, moreover, is compelled by defective vision to wear thick glasses, is always liable to be thus misjudged by inferior minds. And ordinarily, I treat the opinions of my colleagues with the contempt it deserves. But at this particular moment, I was beginning to think that perhaps, after all, there might be something to be said for their view. For, though I might still repudiate the queer bird part of the business, undoubtedly I was an arse, a first-class chump. Otherwise, I should have been spending my holidays in a nice, comfortable way with the rest of the normal world, listening to the periods or winking at the boys on the promenade, or some seaside resort at home, instead of having elected to set out alone on this idiotic push-bike tour of a little-known part of France. Drenched, hungry and lost, a stranger in a strange land, dispiritedly pushing before me a heavily laden bicycle with a gashed tire. Such was the present result of my asinine choice. The storm had overtaken me miles from anywhere, on a road over a spur of the Vosges, and for nearly 2 hours I had trudged through the pelting rain without encountering a living soul, or at least sign of human habitation. And then, at long last, rounding a bend, I glimpsed just ahead of me the chimney-pots and gables of a fair-sized house. It was a lonely, desolate-looking place, standing amid a clump of trees a little way back from the road, and somehow, even at a distance, did not convey a very inviting impression. Nevertheless, in that wilderness, it was a welcome enough sight, and in the hope of finding temporary shelter and possibly a badly needed refreshment, I quickened my pace towards it. 200 yards brought me to the entrance gates, and here I suffered a grievous disappointment, for the roofless porter's lodge and the dilapidated old gates hanging askew on their hinges, and the overgrown drive beyond plainly indicated that the place was no longer inhabited. I speedily comforted myself, however, with the reflection that in circumstances even a deserted house was not to be despised as refuge. Once under cover of some kind, I might make shift to wring out my drenched clothing and repair my damaged mount, and without further ado, I pushed my bicycle up the long-neglected drive and reached the terrace in front of the house itself. It proved to be an old chateau, half smothered in creepers and vines that had long gone wild, and judging by the carved stone coat of arms over the main entrance, had once been occupied by a person of some quality. Mounted on the pedestal on either side of the iron-studded front door stood a rusty carronade, trophies probably of some long-forgotten war in which the former occupier had played a part. Most of the windows had been boarded up, and it was evident that the place had stood empty for many years. I tried the front door. To my surprise, it was unfastened, and a thrust of my shoulder sent it creaking grudgingly back on its hinges. My nostrils, as I stepped in the dim white hall, were at once assailed by the stale, disagreeable odor of rotting woodwork and mouldy hangings and carpets. For a moment or two I stood peering uncertainly about me, with the slight feeling of eeriness that one usually experiences when entering an old, empty house. Facing me was a broad staircase, with a long, stained-glass window, almost opaque with dirt and cobwebs at its head. I mounted the stairs, and throwing open the first door at hand, found myself looking into a spacious, handsomely furnished room that had evidently once been the chief apartment of the house, though long neglect and disuse had now reduced it to a sorry state. The ornate cornice hung here and there in strips, and in one corner the plaster of the ceiling had come down altogether. Green molds covered the 18th century furniture. Curtains and draperies hung in tatters, and one half of the old, beautiful Persian carpet, from a point near the door right across to the fireplace, was overspread by an evil-smelling bright orange fungus. The fireplace gave me an idea. Could I but find fuel, I might light a fire, make myself a hot drink, and get my clothes properly dried. A little searching in the outbuildings discovered a sufficient quantity of old sticks to serve my purpose, and with a bundle of them under my coat, I re-entered the house and briskly made my way upstairs again. But on the threshold of the big room, without quite knowing why, I suddenly checked. It was as though my legs, of their own volition, had all at once become reluctant to carry me further into the apartment, as if something quite outside of me were urging me to turn about and retreat. I laid the sticks down at my feet, and for a moment or two stood there uncertainly in the doorway. I was beginning to sense some subtle suggestion of danger in the atmosphere of the place. Everything was apparently just as I had left it. Yet I had an uneasy sort of feeling that during my brief absence, something evil had entered that room and left it again. I am neither a nervous nor a superstitious person, yet I found myself a moment later rather shamefacedly picking up my sticks and moving back towards the head of the stairs. Actually, it was not so much fear as a vague, precautionary sense of unease that prompted me. It had occurred to me that perhaps I might feel more comfortable if I remained nearer the front door and made my fire in one of the rooms on the ground floor. If, it was an idiotic fancy, I know, but, well, if anything queer did happen, and I had to make a sudden bolt for it, I could get out quicker that way. It was on this second descent of the stairs, as I faced the light from the open front door, that I suddenly noticed something that pulled me up with a decided start. Running up the center of the staircase, and quite fresh in the thick dust, was a broad, broken sort of track, exactly as though someone had recently trailed up an empty sack or something of that nature. From the foot of the staircase, I traced this track across the hall to a spot immediately below an old, moth-eaten coat that hung from one of a row of coat pegs on the opposite wall. And then I saw that similar tracks traversed the hall in various directions, some terminating before the doors on either side, others leading past the foot of the stairs to the rear regions of the house, but all seeming to radiate from the same point below the coat pegs. And the queerest thing about it all was that of footprints, other than my own, there was not a sign. Uneasiness once more assailed me. The house appeared to be uninhabited, and yet plainly someone, or something, had recently been in the place. Who or what was the restless, questing creature that had made those strange tracks to and from the old coat? Was it some half-witted vagrant? Another woman, possibly, whose trailing draperies obliterated her own footprints? I had a closer look at the old garment. It was a military greatcoat of ancient pattern, with one or two tarnished silver buttons still attached to it, and had evidently seen much service. Turning it round on its peg, with a gingerly finger and thumb, I discovered that just below the left shoulder there was a round hole as big as a penny, surrounded by an area of scorched and stained cloth, as though a heavy pistol had been fired into it, at point-blank range. If a pistol bullet had indeed made that hole, then obviously the old coat at one point of its existence had clothed a dead man. A sudden repugnance for the thing overcame me, and with a slight shudder I let go of it. It may have been fancy or not, but all at once it seemed to me that there was more than an odor of mold and rotting cloth emanating from the thing. There was a taint of putrefying flesh and bone, and a taint of animal corruption, faint but unmistakable. I could sniff it in the air, and with it, something less definable but no less real, a sort of sick sense feeling that the whole atmosphere of the place was slowly becoming charged with evil emanations from a black and shameful past. With an effort, I pulled myself together. After all, what was there to be scared about? I had no need to fear human murderers, for in my hip pocket I carried a small but serviceable automatic. And as for ghosts, well, if such existed, they didn't usually walk in the daytime. The place certainly felt creepy, and I shouldn't have cared to spend the night there, but it would be ridiculous to allow mere idle fancies to drive me out again into that beastly rain before I'd made myself that badly needed hot beverage and rented my bicycle. I therefore opened the door nearest to me and entered a smallish room that apparently had once been used as a study. The fireplace was on the side opposite to the door, and the wide ancient grate was still choked with ashes that the last log consumed there. I picked up the poker, a cumbersome old thing with a knob as big as an orange, raked out the ashes, and laid my stick in approved Boy Scout fashion. But the wood was damp, and after I had used up all my matches, refused to do more than smolder, whilst the backdraft from the chimney filled the room with smoke. In desperation, I went down on my hands and knees and tried to rouse the embers into flame by blowing on them. In the middle of this irksome operation, I was startled by a sound of movement in the hall. A single, soft flop, as though someone had flung down a garment. I was on my feet in a flash, listening with every nerve at taut. No further sound came, and, automatic in hand, I tiptoed to the door. There was nothing in the hall, nothing to be heard at all save the steady swish of the rain outside. From a spot on the floor, directly below the old coat, the dust was raising in a little eddying cloud, as though it had just been disturbed. "Ah, a rat," I told myself, and went back to my task. More vigorous blowing on the embers, more raking and poking, more striking of matches, and in the midst of it, again came that curious noise. Not very loud, but plain and unmistakable. Once more I went into the hall, and once more, except for another little cloud of dust raising from precisely the same spot as before, there was nothing to be seen. But that sixth sense warning of imminent danger was becoming more insistent. I had the feeling now that I was no longer alone in the old empty hall, that some unclean, invisible presence was lurking there, tainting the very air with its foulness. "It's no use," I said to myself. "I may be a nervous fool, but I can't stand any more of this. I'll collect my traps and clear out whilst the going's good." With this, I went back into the room, and keeping a nervous eye cocked on the door, began with rather panicky haste to repack my haversack. And just as I was in the act of tightening the last strap, there came from the hall a low, evil chuckle, followed by the sound of steady movement. I whipped out my weapon and stood where I was in the middle of the floor, facing the door, with my blood turning to ice. Through the chink between the door hinges, I saw a shadow pass. Then the door creaked a little, slowly began to open, and round it came the coat. It stood there, upright in the doorway, as God is above me, swaying a little, as though uncertain of its balance, collar and shoulders extended as though by an invisible wearer. The old musty coat I had seen hanging in the hall. For a space that seemed an eternity, I stood like a man of stone, facing the thing, as it seemed to pause on the threshold. A dreadful sort of hypnotism held me rooted to the spot on which I stood. A hypnotism that completely paralyzed my body, causing the pistol to slip from my nerveless fingers, and yet left my brain clear. Mingled with my frozen terror was a feeling of deadly nausea. I knew that I was in the presence of ultimate evil. That very aura of the hell-engendered thing reared there in the doorway was contamination, that its actual touch would not only mean the instant destruction of my body, but the everlasting damnation of my soul. And now it was coming into the room, with an indescribable bobbing sort of motion, the empty sleeves jerking grotesquely at its sides, the skirts flopping and trailing in the dust, was slowly coming towards me. And step by step, with my bulging eyes riveted in awful fascination on the thing, I was recoiling before it. Step by step, with rigid, unconscious movement of automation, I drew back until I was brought up with my back pressed into the fireplace and could retreat no further. And still, with deadly malevolent purpose, the thing crept towards me. The sleeves were raising and shakily reaching out to me, and then I knew with the most dreadful certainty that my reason would snap. A coherent thought somehow came into my burning brain, something that I had read or heard of long ago. The power of the holy sign against the forces of evil. With a last desperate effort of will, I stretched out a palsied finger and made the sign of the cross, and in that instant, my other hand, scrambling frenziedly at the wall behind me, came into contact with something cold and hard and round. It was the knob of the old heavy poker. The touch of the cold iron seemed to give me instant repossession of my faculties. And with lightning swiftness, I swung up the heavy poker and struck with all my force at the nightmare horror before. And lo, on the instant, the thing collapsed and became an old coat. Nothing more. Lying there in a heap at my feet. Yet on my oath, as I cleared the hellish thing in a flying leap and fled from the room, I saw it, out of the tail of my eye, gathering itself together and making shape, as if it were to scramble after me. Once outside that accursed house, I ran as never woman ran before, and I remember nothing more until I found myself half fainting before the door of a little inn. "Bring wine, in the name of God!" I cried, staggering inside. Wine was brought, and a little wondering group stood round me while I drank. I tried to explain to them in my bad French. They continued to regard me with puzzled looks. At length, a look of understanding came into the landlord's face. "Mon Dieu," he gasped. "It is possible that Madame will need another bottle of wine." Later, I got something of the story from the landlord, though he was by no means eager to tell it. The deserted house had once been occupied by a retired officer of Napoleon's army. Judging from the landlord's story, he must have been one of the worst men that God ever allowed to walk the earth. "Most certainly, mademoiselle, he was a bad man, that one," concluded my host. "He killed his wife and tortured every living thing he could lay his hands on, even his own daughters. In the end, one of them shot him in the back. The old chateau has an evil name, and if you offered £1,000,000, you would not get one of our country folks to go near the place." As I said at the beginning, I know that the other fellows in the office are inclined, as it is, to regard me as being a bit queer, and so I haven't told them this story. Nevertheless, it's perfectly true. My brand new bicycle and touring traps are probably still lying where I left them in the hall of that devil-ridden chateau. Anybody who cares to collect them may keep them.